Hey everyone!
Welcome back
to Slam and Glam. My name is Mia.
And I am Arlen.
This week we're taking you through a series of movies,
podcast
that we've been using in order to educate ourselves about the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the history of social injustice in the U.S. By educating ourselves, we're hoping to be able to identify the root cause of the problem by having a better understanding of why things are the way they are. And hopefully, each of us will use this understanding to collaborate with one another and create solutions that can help solve the social injustice system in the US specifically, as well as around the world. First of all, I want to talk about 13th. This well-known documentary is directed by Ava DuVernay. This filmmaker also directed Netflix limited series called When They See Us. This documentary talks about the criminalization of the Black community, as well as the continuation of slavery after American Civil War under a different form, imprisonment. For those of you who aren't familiar with American history, after the American Civil War ended in 1865, slavery was abolished. In the same year, the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution.
13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals.
So what basically this law is saying is that all men are free except if you're a criminal. So in order to continue slavery, politicians started to criminalize Black men specifically, and also the Black community, by arresting them for minor crimes. The white political elite needed Black bodies working. That's why they put these free men to work if they couldn't pay fines. The movie proceeds to laying out how the media and politicians like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush have been constructing this narrative that heavily targeted and criminalized the Black community.
Animals, beasts that needed to be controlled.
You better believe it. I'm only human.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
This leads to a mass incarceration of African Americans by the end of the 20th century. After watching this movie, I realized that the oppression that the Black community faces today is embedded in the entire social injustice system. The injustice against their community has never ended. It was simply reworded and paraphrased into abstract policies under the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, as well as the Clinton administration, in order to justify the injustice that we're committing against the Black community. The movie also made me aware of the power of words and the media, and also of how important it is for us as voters, as learners, as change makers, to really pay attention to the implicit meaning behind policies that politicians put out. We also need to point out dog whistle politics so that the media as well as politicians cannot continue this unjust narrative against the Black community as well as other minority communities. While I was watching the movie, it really hurt my heart to witness all the violence that was committed against the Black community post-American Civil War. But you know what hurts me even more? It hurts me that this is still true today. This is still happening today in 2020. That movie, The 13th, was made in 2016. And while I was watching it, it felt like it was made yesterday. We, as change makers, as voters, as learners, and simply as citizens of the world, we need to force a conversation among ourselves. We also need to reteach ourselves to see someone for who they are, to look at them and see them for themselves and not based on any preconceived notions or any narrative that politicians or the media have been forcing upon us.
The first podcast is 1619 Project.
Like most Americans, slavery was largely taught to me as something that was marginal to the American story. Slavery had to be mentioned in our history books because we had to talk about the Civil War. But outside of that, it was just a brief discussion that relegated slavery largely to the backward South and assured us as a nation that slavery had little to do with how our country developed. What if I told you that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as the year 1776? What if I told you that America is a country born of both an idea and a lie?
Produced and hosted by Nikole Hannah Jones, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter covering racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. This audio series consists of 6 episodes and was produced in 2019. Using captivating storytelling techniques, the host goes back and forward describing important historical events and giving her personal experience in order to reframe the country's history.
And I was taking my first Black Studies class, and I read these words by historian Lerone Bennett, where he described the White Lion, which is the ship of that first group of enslaved Africans to Virginia.
Besides learning about the history of slavery in our country and the contribution of Black Americans and how history has been reshaped for political gains, I learned that the civil rights movement was not only about the civil rights of Black communities.
That we did something much less understood, but much more important. And that is that Black people have played one of the most vital roles. Black people responded to their enslavement by demanding and fighting not just for their own rights, but for universal rights. All the way to now, when we see the Black Lives Matter protests, then we must acknowledge that it is Black people who have fought more than any other group to make the ideals laid out in the Constitution a reality.
Bottom line, my friends, fighting for equality for the Black community is also fighting for equality for all. We are all in this together. The second podcast I found is called Intersectionality Matter. It took me a while to pronunciate that word. I will explain it later. It's a podcast hosted by Kimberlé Crenshaw, an American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar of critical race theory. Each episode in this podcast explores a different topic through an intersectional lens. Mrs. Crenshaw coined the term 30 years ago. Then it went viral. My head has so many questions about this podcast, starting with what does intersectionality mean? So I went straight up to my friend Google and its friend Wikipedia defined this term as a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identity, example, gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, hate, etc., might combine to create unique modes of discrimination. After understanding the term intersectionality, I understood that Mrs. Crenshaw seeks to explain to her audience the deep structural and systematic questions about discrimination and inequality that the Black community suffer. In addition, Mrs. Crenshaw just created another series called Under the Black Light, and on it there is an emergency episode called
Under the Black Light, the FIRE this time.
She and her special guest addressed the historic moment of social and political mobilization ignited by George Floyd's death just a couple of weeks ago. Well, friends, I hope these podcast recommendations are useful for your research to understand why things are happening. I invite you to educate yourself and push conversation forward and remind that this is a country where all the people are equal and are free. See you next time. Besos y abrazos.